Hello everyone, and welcome back to Chilly Midnight. I'm Leanh, and before tonight's story begins, I'd like to briefly clear up something that many people still ask about. The voice you hear on this channel is not my natural speaking voice. Instead, I use an AI-generated voice from Elevenlabs called Burt Reynolds. So if you've ever wondered whether I'm the person behind that voice, the answer is no. Burt Reynolds is simply the voice model I use for narration. I chose it because its calm, steady tone fits the relaxing late-night atmosphere I want to create here on Chilly Midnight. While the voice itself is AI-generated, everything else comes from me. Every story, every character, every unsettling moment, and every twist is written and developed by me personally. I completely understand why some listeners have been curious about the narrator. But I hope we can put that question to rest and focus on what really matters, the stories themselves and the experience of spending a quiet evening together. Today is June 3rd. Leanh, and wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, thank you for being here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how many different countries, cities, and time zones gather here after dark. And if tonight's story happens to touch on your profession or something you've experienced yourself, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. Now, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan for a little background hum, and leave the stresses of the day behind. The world outside can wait until morning. For now, it's just you, the darkness, and tonight's story. And let's step quietly into the darkness together. By the time Nathaniel Bell reached Embankment Station, the rain had found its way through the collar of his coat and down the back of his neck. It was a cold, needling rain, the kind that seemed less like weather than accusation. It clung to the glass doors of office lobbies, slicked the pavements into black mirrors, and turned every passing bus into a blur of white headlights and red brake lights. Nate walked with his shoulders slightly raised, one hand gripping the strap of his leather satchel, the other buried in his pocket around a broken piece of balsa wood. He had not meant to keep it. The piece had snapped off the model that morning, a delicate section of roof from a proposed public concourse near Old Street. 6 weeks of work had gone into that model. Not only his work, of course. There had been lighting engineers, survey drawings, printed figures, tiny trees, transparent acrylic walls, painted benches smaller than fingernail clippings. But the roof had been his. He had cut every rib by hand, sanded every join smooth, pinned the curve in place beneath warm lamps until it held its shape. Then, at 9:10, the client had leaned over the display table, frowned, and said, "It looks dead." That had been the beginning of the day. By noon, the project director had stopped making eye contact with him. By 3, the unpaid invoice had been mentioned in a tone of careful regret. By 5, someone from procurement had asked whether he could leave the model in the studio until they decided what to do with it. By 6, his key card had stopped working. Though no one admitted this was intentional. "It's just the system," the receptionist had said, smiling at him with the particular kindness reserved for people who were being removed from places. So Nate had packed his knives, glues, scale rulers, spare blades, and a small tin of human figures into his satchel. Men in gray suits, women in dark coats, children holding hands with adults, commuters made of plastic and painted by machine, each one frozen forever in the act of going somewhere. Now he descended into the underground with the last of the rain ticking behind him on the steps. The station smelled of wet wool, brake dust, old heat, and something faintly metallic. At that hour, just after midnight, it had lost the restless violence of the day. No crowds pressing forward, no buskers, no tourists blocking the barriers with paper tickets held the wrong way up. Only a few scattered people moving with the blank, private urgency of those who had stayed out too late, worked too long, or delayed going home until home itself had become another obligation. Nate tapped his card at the barrier. It opened with a soft, mechanical complaint. For a moment, he paused, beyond the gates. A poster on the tiled wall advertised luxury flats above a station entrance that did not yet exist. The artist's impression showed warm windows, young trees, pale stone, clean paving, people smiling beneath impossible sunlight. He knew the rendering. He had built an early consultation model for the same developer 2 years earlier. In the model, every person had been placed carefully enough to suggest life without allowing any actual mess. A cyclist, a mother with a pram, 2 men outside a cafe, a child pointing upward, no litter, no damp, no one sleeping in the recessed doorway, no old man arguing with a ticket machine, no boy standing alone behind the yellow line, trying not to cry. Nate blinked. The thought had arrived too cleanly, like a voice spoken beside his ear. He turned, but there was no boy, only the poster, shining under fluorescent light, and his own reflection ghosted across the glass. He moved on. The escalator carried him down through tiled silence. A woman in a green coat stood 3 steps ahead, holding a bunch of flowers upside down by their stems. Water dripped from the petals onto the moving metal step below her. Tick, tick, tick. Nate watched each drop vanish into the grooves. At the bottom, the woman turned toward the district line. Nate followed the signs for the northern line. Though halfway through the passage, he had the strange feeling that the arrows had changed while he was looking at them. He stopped beneath one. Northern line. It said, underneath, in smaller letters. Someone had scratched a sentence into the enamel with a key or blade. Last chances this way. Nate stared at it. The words were thin and childish, almost swallowed by old scratches and grime. He leaned closer. Perhaps it said something else. Lost charges, lift changes, some half-removed maintenance note. The underground accumulated marks the way skin accumulated scars. And most meant nothing unless you wanted them to. Behind him, somewhere in the passage, a speaker crackled. A voice said, "The next train is the last train." Then the speaker cut out. Nate looked down the corridor. The woman with the flowers was gone. So were the 2 men he thought had been behind him at the barriers. The passage seemed longer than it should have been, its tiled walls narrowing toward a bend he did not remember from this station. He told himself he was tired. That was all. Tired people noticed patterns that were not there. Tired people thought of old things. Tired people let a bad day become a haunting because a bad day wanted drama, wanted shape, wanted to feel like fate instead of ordinary professional failure. He continued to the platform. A train was already waiting. Its doors stood open. The interior lights shone with that hard, sleepless brightness that made everyone look slightly unwell. Nate glanced at the display board above the platform. It should have shown a destination, a delay, a warning about planned works. Instead, the orange LEDs flickered between broken fragments. More, no, return. Then it settled. Special service. Nate frowned. He had lived in London long enough to mistrust anything called special. The platform was nearly empty. A young man in a delivery jacket sat hunched over his phone at the far end. A woman with a suitcase stood near the stairs, her face hidden beneath the hood of a transparent raincoat. Closer to Nate, an old paper ticket lay just behind the yellow safety line, softened by damp, its printed edge curling upward. He noticed paper tickets whenever he saw them. They belonged to another version of the city, a city of ticket windows, stamped dates, coins slid beneath glass, decisions made with physical objects in hand. This one was pale orange, the old magnetic stripe dark along one side. Nate stepped around it and entered the nearest carriage. The smell changed immediately. Inside the train, it was warmer, but not comfortably warm. It had the trapped heat of clothes that had been worn too long. The seats were upholstered in the familiar patterned fabric, all red, blue, and gray interruptions, designed to hide stains by becoming one. The windows were black, not dark with tunnel, exactly, but black in the polished way of turned-off screens. There was only one other passenger in the carriage. He sat opposite the doors, 3 seats down from the end, hands folded over the handle of a closed black umbrella. He was perhaps 60, perhaps older, thin, neat, wearing a charcoal overcoat buttoned to the throat. His face had that underground stillness some people cultivated, the stern refusal to participate in strangers. Yet his eyes were open and fixed, not on an advert, not on the floor, not on his own reflection, but on Nate. Nate chose a seat as far from him as possible. The doors chimed. "Please stand clear of the doors," said the recorded voice. No one else boarded. Nate looked out through the open doorway. The delivery rider was gone. The woman with the suitcase was gone. The paper ticket remained on the platform, trembling slightly in the breath of the train. The doors closed. The train moved. At once, Nate felt the day loosen its grip on him. Movement had always done that. It gave the illusion of progress. The carriage rocked, lights flashing against the tunnel walls. Black glass, returning his faint reflection in pieces, forehead, cheek, collar, the pale oval of one hand. He checked his phone. No signal. Of course, he opened his satchel and looked inside, though he needed nothing from it. Tools, wrapped in cloth, a small cutting mat, the tin of figures, the broken curve of roof. He touched it with one finger and felt again the moment it had snapped. It looks dead. The client had not been wrong. That was what bothered him. The station model had been precise, elegant, proportionate, every surface aligned, every entrance legible, every route visible. But there had been no life in it. Nate had placed the tiny people last, as he always did, and he had arranged them at measured intervals, evenly distributed across the concourse, avoiding clutter. A station with people who did not touch each other. a public space where no one needed anything. The train began to slow. Nate glanced up. They should have been approaching Waterloo. He could already imagine the tiled curve of the platform. The late-night passengers waiting with their damp bags and blank faces. But the train did not stop. It passed the platform at a steady, almost ceremonial pace. Nate saw the station through the window, white tiles, black mouth of the tunnel, advertisement boards, yellow line. All the lights were on. But the platform was empty except for one person. A boy stood near the middle of it. He was about 14, maybe 15, wearing a dark school blazer too large in the shoulders. His hair was wet and plastered to his forehead. He held a paper ticket in both hands, pinched carefully between thumb and forefinger, as if afraid it might dissolve. Nate's breath caught. The boy turned his head as the train passed. For less than a second, their faces aligned in the dark glass. Not similar. The same narrow mouth. The same gray eyes. The same small scar beneath the left eyebrow from falling against a radiator at the age of 9. The same expression Nate remembered from old photographs and had spent years training himself not to remember too often. Then the platform was gone. The train entered the tunnel again, and the window became black. Nate sat very still, across the carriage. The man with the umbrella had not moved. Nate looked toward the connecting door at the end of the carriage, expecting someone to laugh, cough, shift in their seat, do anything ordinary enough to restore proportion. Nothing happened. The train rocked gently onward beneath London, carrying its bright, nearly empty room through the dark. After a moment, the man opposite him spoke. "You saw the first one," he said. Nate's fingers tightened around the broken piece of roof until the balsa wood split in his hand. "You saw the first one," the man said. Nate did not answer. For several seconds, he could not even persuade himself that the words had been spoken aloud. The carriage made its ordinary sounds around him, the metallic rhythm of wheels against rail, the low electrical hum beneath the floor, the faint rattle of the doors in their seals. The man's voice seemed to belong to those sounds, as if the train itself had found a throat. Nate looked down at his hand. The strip of balsa wood had split cleanly between his fingers. A pale crescent of the model roof lay across his palm like a broken rib. He placed it back inside his satchel with unnecessary care. "I'm sorry," he said. The man opposite him tilted his head a fraction. The first one is usually the easiest to mistake. Nate swallowed. His mouth had gone dry. There was no one there. "Then why did you stop breathing?" Nate looked toward the window. Nothing showed beyond it now except the dark tunnel and the reflection of the carriage interior. His own face floated in the glass, faint and gray. The man's reflection sat behind him, smaller, stiller, his folded hands resting on the black umbrella. Nate turned back. "I'm not having this conversation." "That is what you said before." The words were mild, not threatening. That made them worse. Nate stood, gripping the pole beside his seat as the train swayed. He expected the old familiar irritation to rise in him. The Londoner's hard shell against strangers. Drunks, preachers, men who spoke nonsense after midnight. But beneath the irritation was something colder and more precise. He walked to the doors and pressed the open button. Nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. The train was moving. It was a stupid thing to do. The kind of thing a panicked tourist might do. and the shame of it helped him breathe again. He sat down nearer the doors, facing away from the man. He would wait until the next station, get off, report a passenger behaving strangely. If necessary, find another line, walk home. It would be inconvenient. But inconvenience was solid. Inconvenience belonged to the same world as delayed trains and failed invoices and wet socks. The train continued beneath the city. Nate kept his eyes on the floor. The patterned carriage floor was scuffed by thousands of shoes, darkened in places where spilled coffee, rainwater, and time had worked themselves into the material. Near his left foot, someone had dropped a torn corner of a ticket. Not an oyster receipt, not a contactless slip. A paper ticket. It was too old to be there. He bent without meaning to and picked it up. The paper was soft, nearly furred at the edge from damp. Across the top, faded purple ink marked a date. Most of it had blurred, but he could read the day clearly. 17 Oct. He stopped moving. That date was not rare. There were millions of 17ths of October, birthdays, appointments, ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays. It did not have to mean anything. Still, his thumb found the magnetic stripe along the back, and for a moment he was not 42. Not wet through, not sitting on a late-night train after losing a commission. He was 14 again, standing on a platform with a ticket in his hand, watching his younger brother pull faces in the black window of an approaching train. Eli had loved reflections, not mirrors exactly. Mirrors made him self-conscious. But windows at night, television screens after they had been turned off, dark puddles on pavement, anything that gave the world back slightly wrong. He liked to lean close and make himself monstrous in them, eyes wide, mouth stretched, fingers crooked beside his cheeks. "Look," he would say. "That one's the other me." Nate would tell him to stop being stupid. Eli never did. The memory closed before it reached the platform edge. Nate made it close. He folded the ticket corner and put it in his coat pocket. His hand came out shaking slightly. So he tucked both hands beneath his arms and stared at the advertisement above the opposite seats. It was for a new riverside development. Computer-generated balconies, soft golden lights. A woman in linen holding a cup of coffee on a terrace no wind would ever reach. At the bottom, in clean white text, "A life designed around you." He almost laughed. That was what he did, or what people paid him to pretend they did. He built the small, clean lie before the large, expensive one was built over the world. His workshop occupied the back room of a former printing office in Kentish Town, above a shop that sold refurbished phones, and below a flat where someone played piano badly every Sunday morning. The room had 3 windows, 2 of which were painted shut. Shelves ran from floor to ceiling, loaded with basswood sheets, acrylic rods, blades, adhesives, paint jars, tiny cars, trees, people, benches, bins, lampposts, signs, railings, bicycle racks, and packets of scale grass. Everything had a place. People liked that about Nate before they disliked it. Clients liked his precision. Architects liked how he translated their abstractions into something they could touch. Developers liked how he made displacement look like improvement. Planning committees liked his little trees, his little wheelchair users, his little parents pushing prams through courtyards where no one had yet been priced out. Real people were harder. Real people called unexpectedly. They needed answers before he had arranged his thoughts. They cried at inconvenient times. They asked what he meant by his silences. They remembered things differently. They stood too close. They wanted apologies that did not fit neatly into the boxes where he kept tools, invoices, receipts, and the few letters he had never thrown away. So he had trained his life into manageable scale. He worked alone. He ate alone more often than not. He let friendships become annual messages, then old contacts, then names he recognized only when social media reminded him they had children, cancer, new houses, dead parents. He had relationships the way some people kept plants in rooms without enough light, with good intentions, private guilt, and no real expectation that anything would thrive. When his mother had died 3 winters earlier, the funeral director had asked if there were any siblings to notify. Nate had said no. Not anymore. Just no. The lie had been efficient. Efficient lies were the easiest to maintain. They did not require invention, only subtraction. The train lights flickered. Nate blinked and saw. For half a second, the workshop table under its lamps. The failed model sat there in fragments. The concourse roof collapsed inward. Tiny people lay scattered on their sides across the white floor. A plastic child, no taller than a grain of rice, was trapped beneath a clear acrylic stairwell. Then the carriage returned. The man opposite him was watching. "You make stations," the man said. Nate's throat tightened. "What places people pass through?" Nate turned his head slowly. "Did you follow me?" "No." "Then how do you know that?" The man looked at the black window beside Nate. "It is written all over you." Nate let out a short, humorless breath. "That's not an answer." "It rarely is." The train began to curve. The lights along the tunnel came in bright intervals, cutting across the man's face. Old, gone. Old, gone. Nate forced himself to speak evenly. "I don't know what you think this is, but I'm getting off at the next stop." "No one gets off at the next stop. We'll see." "Yes," the man said. "That is the purpose of the journey." Nate looked away. He did not want to ask. Asking would accept the shape of the conversation. Asking would give the man power. But the question had already entered the carriage and sat there with them. What journey? The man's fingers shifted on the umbrella handle. They were long and clean. The nails trimmed almost painfully short. The one for people who missed the important decision. Nate stared at him. Outside the window, the tunnel gave way to another platform. The train was slowing again. Nate stood at once. This time he positioned himself directly in front of the doors. His reflection stood with him in the glass. Wet hair, tired eyes, coat darkened by rain. One hand braced against the yellow pole. The platform lights stretched into long white bars across his face. "We're stopping," he said. The man did not move. The train slowed further, wheels screaming faintly against the curve. But the doors remained locked. The station name slid into view on the tiled wall. It was not Waterloo. It was not any station Nate knew. The sign read, "Bell and Son Model Makers." Nate's hand went cold on the pole. The platform beyond the glass was no longer tiled like an underground station. It had the shape of one. The rails, the yellow line, the arched wall, the old lights, but behind the lines stood the front of his workshop, impossibly reconstructed beneath the city. Shelves of wood, cutting mats, desk lamps, transparent boxes of miniature people, a kettle with a cracked handle, his own stool, and there, seated at the workbench on the platform, was another Nate, older than the boy from the first station, younger than Nate was now, perhaps 28, thin from bad food and long hours, with glue on his fingers and a smear of white paint across one sleeve. He bent over a model station with such fierce concentration that he did not look up as the train passed. Beside his elbow sat a framed photograph. Nate knew that photograph. He had kept it face down in a drawer for 17 years. In it, two boys stood on a railway platform. Nate at 14, stiff with embarrassment. Ellie at 11, grinning too widely. One hand raised in a blurred wave at the camera. Their mother's thumb covered the corner of the lens. As the train glided past the workbench, the younger Nate on the platform reached for the frame without looking and turned it face down. Inside the carriage, Nate felt the motion in his own hand. He had done that. Not once, hundreds of times. The platform began to slip away. "No," Nate whispered. The man with the umbrella spoke from behind him. "You practiced forgetting until it became your craft." Nate turned on him, the anger arriving at last, because anger was easier than fear. "Who are you?" The man looked past him, toward the disappearing platform, toward the younger Nate, who would not raise his eyes from the miniature station. "I am not the one you should be asking about." The tunnel swallowed the workshop. The window went black again. Nate's reflection returned. But this time, there was another reflection beside his. Lower, smaller, standing just behind his shoulder. A boy's wet face looked back at him from the dark glass. Eli smiled, pressed one finger to his lips, and whispered from inside the window, "You still haven't told him where you were standing." Eli smiled from inside the window. Nate did not move. The boy's face hovered in the black glass with the pale, underwater look of reflections seen on a train at night. Wet hair clung to his forehead. His school collar sat crooked beneath his blazer. One of his front teeth overlapped the other, the way it had before braces. Before the appointment, their mother had kept meaning to book. Before appointments had become something no one mentioned, because the person who needed them was no longer there. One finger rested against his lips. "You still haven't told him where you were standing," Eli whispered. The voice did not come through the speaker system. It did not come from the man with the umbrella. It came from the glass. Nate stumbled backward so violently that his shoulder struck the door. The impact sent a bolt of pain down his arm. He looked away, then back. The window showed only his own reflection. His breath came out in short, ugly bursts. He touched the door behind him as if making sure it was solid, as if the carriage had not become some soft membrane through which dead boys could press their faces. Across from him, the man remained seated. "Do not look too quickly," he said. "They vanish when you try to make them ordinary." Nate's lips parted, but no sound came. "Sit down," the man said. "No, you may fall." I said no. The man accepted this with a slight inclination of his head. Then hold on. The train lurched. Not badly. Not enough to throw a standing passenger under normal circumstances. But Nate's knees had gone unreliable. He grabbed the yellow pole just as the carriage gave a long, shuddering sigh as though the tunnels ahead had narrowed around it. The lights flickered once, twice. When they steadied, the route map above the doors had changed. Nate noticed it because he had been avoiding the windows. His eyes had fixed on the map without intention, searching for something printed, official, incapable of whispering. The colored line should have shown familiar station names in their ordered chain. Embankment, Waterloo, Kennington, Clapham, Morden. Instead, the white ovals contained words he did not know how to read at first, because his mind refused to arrange them into meaning. First delay, under the stairs. Mother's kitchen, the call you let ring. Platform 17, no witnesses. The place you stood. The train hummed beneath him. Nate stared until the words seemed to loosen and float. He blinked hard. When he looked again, the map was normal. Almost. Only one station remained wrong. Between Waterloo and Kennington, printed in the same clean underground font, was a stop called The Place You Stood. Nate's stomach tightened. "I don't know what this is," he said, though nobody had asked. The man's gaze lifted to the map and then returned to Nate. That is usually the second lie. What? The first is that nothing happened. The second is that you do not know what happened. Nate laughed once. A dry, broken sound. You're enjoying this. No. You expect me to believe you're some kind of what? Guide? Judge? I expect nothing from you. Then why are you talking? Because silence is how you got here. The words struck harder than they should have. Nate looked toward the next carriage. Through the glass panel in the connecting door, he could see another lit compartment. Empty seats. Hanging straps. Advertisements. It looked ordinary enough. If he moved there, perhaps the man would not follow. Perhaps the windows there would remain windows. Perhaps this carriage was the wrong one. The infected one. The place where panic had gathered. He started toward it. The door did not open. He pushed the button. Nothing happened. He gripped the handle and pulled. It stayed shut. Behind him, the man said, "You cannot change carriages after boarding." Nate turned, furious. Stop saying things like they mean something. They do. No, they don't. They sound meaningful. That isn't the same thing. At this, the man almost smiled. It was faint. More sadness than amusement. You always did understand models. Nate looked at him carefully. Something in that sentence had been too intimate. Not merely knowledge of his work. Knowledge of the private contempt he held for anything imprecise. People spoke in metaphors when they wanted to avoid responsibility. People used symbols when they had no evidence. Nate built things small enough to inspect from every side. He trusted scale rulers, sharp blades, exact measurements. But the train was moving through a city where the stations had begun naming his life. The carriage slowed again. Nate did not want to look. His body did it before permission arrived. Outside the window, the darkness thinned into a platform washed in weak yellow light. The tiles were old cream, cracked in places, stained near the ceiling by damp. A bench stood under a flickering sign. There were no adverts, no CCTV cameras, no litter bins, no late-night passengers checking phones, only the bench and the sign behind it. The station name read, "The Call You Let Ring." Sitting on the bench was Nate. Not the boy from the first platform, not the 28-year-old at the workbench. This Nate was old. 70. Perhaps, maybe older. His hair had thinned to a white, uneven mist around his scalp. His shoulders curved inward beneath an overcoat too large for him. His hands trembled in his lap. Empty, except for a paper ticket, folded and unfolded so many times it had begun to come apart along its creases. He was crying, not dramatically, not with his face in his hands. Tears moved down his cheeks without changing his expression, as if his body had continued grieving long after the rest of him had become too tired to participate. The train passed slowly enough for Nate to see the old man's shoes. Brown leather, cracked at the toes. His own shoes. A ridiculous detail to notice. Then the old Nate lifted his head. Their eyes met through the glass. The old man mouthed something. Nate leaned closer despite himself. One hand pressed to the door. Again, the old man mouthed the words. I answered too late. The platform vanished. The tunnel returned with a roar. Nate backed away until his legs struck a seat and he sat down hard. For a while, there was only the sound of the train. He felt something in his coat pocket. Vibration. His phone. The screen lit against the dark fabric before he pulled it free. For one wild second he thought signal had returned. And with it, the ordinary world. He would call emergency services. He would call Transport for London. He would call anyone. The screen showed 17 missed calls. Nate stared. There had been no signal a moment ago. There was no signal now. No bars at the top of the screen. Only the empty triangle of disconnection. Yet the missed calls were listed one after another. Mum, 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 then home, then unknown, then Ellie. Nate nearly dropped the phone. His brother's name had not been in his contacts for years. Nate had deleted it first from his phone, then restored it once in a fit of guilt, then deleted it again when seeing it made him avoid the entire contacts list. Later, after upgrades and replacements and cloud backups, the name had disappeared properly, as all things eventually did, if one stopped touching them. But there it was, Ellie. The missed call time read 017. Nate's thumb hovered over it. No, he whispered. The screen changed. A voicemail notification appeared. One new message. The man with the umbrella said nothing. Nate looked at him. Did you do this? No. Who did? The man's eyes moved to the phone. You kept the number. I didn't. You kept everything. You only changed where you put it. Nate's thumb was still above the screen. He could ignore it. That was the sensible thing. Phones malfunctioned. Panic produced hallucinations. Exhaustion made memory aggressive. He had been under pressure all day. He had not eaten since a sandwich at 11 in the morning. His blood sugar was low. His mind had seized a date, a bad day, a humiliating meeting, a stranger's nonsense, and built a little theater for itself, a model. That thought did not comfort him. The voicemail notification remained. The train lights dimmed, not out, just lower, as if someone had turned a dial. The carriage became softer, older. The red and blue seat pattern darkened toward bruised colors. The advertisements lost their gloss. The man opposite him looked less like a passenger and more like someone who had been waiting in that seat for years. Nate pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, rain. Not recorded rain. Not the clean hiss of weather through a phone microphone, but the hollow echo of rain inside a station, water dripping from umbrellas, shoes squeaking on wet tile, distant announcements made soft by tunnels. A boy breathed close to the receiver. Nate closed his eyes. He knew that breathing. Eli had breathed like that when he was trying not to cry. A faint catch at the top of each inhale, followed by a stubborn little silence, as if he could hide distress by trapping it inside his ribs. Then their mother's voice, far away and frantic. "Nathaniel, pick up. Please pick up. He's not with you. Please tell me he's with you." A beep. Another message began immediately. This one was shorter. Their mother again, but changed. Smaller, older in the space of minutes. "Nate, I'm at the station. They said there was an incident. Call me back. Please, please call me back." Another beep. Then Eli's voice. "Nate?" The carriage seemed to tilt. Nate gripped the phone with both hands. Eli sounded breathless. Wet. Embarrassed. Not frightened yet. Not fully. "I know you're angry. I didn't mean to follow you. Mom said you'd take me if I asked properly. But you left before I could. I'm at the platform. I can see you." Static swallowed the next few seconds. Then Eli again, closer to tears now. "You're looking at me. Why are you pretending you can't see me?" The voicemail ended. Nate sat with the phone in his hands as the screen went dark. The reflection in it showed his face from below, pale and hollow-eyed. "I didn't have my phone," he said. The man watched him. I'd left it at home that day." "Did you?" "Yes." "Is that what you remember? Or what you needed later?" Nate stood so quickly the phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the carriage floor. "Shut up." The man did not flinch. "You were 14, he said. "Children are cruel sometimes. Children are afraid. Children make small choices because they cannot understand the size of them." Nate pointed at him. His hand shook. "You don't know anything about him." "No." The man said softly. "You made sure very few people did." Nate's anger collapsed inward. The next station approached. This time there was no announcement, no braking scream. The train simply slid into light, as though the tunnel had peeled open around them. Nate did not want to look at the name. He looked anyway. Platform 17. The platform was crowded, not with strangers, with Nates. Every age, every possible weight and posture of him, standing behind the yellow line in a long, silent row. A teenage Nate with blood on one sleeve. A young adult Nate in a cheap suit. A middle-aged Nate holding flowers. A barefoot Nate in hospital pajamas. A Nate with a wedding ring. A Nate without one. A Nate whose face had been badly bruised. A Nate laughing too hard at something no one had said. All of them watched the train. All of them were holding paper tickets. And at the far end of the platform, almost hidden behind their shoulders, stood Eli. He was not smiling now. He raised one hand and pointed not at Nate's face, not at the train, but at the narrow strip of floor inside the carriage, just in front of the doors. Nate looked down. A yellow safety line had appeared there, painted across the carriage floor. And on Nate's side of the line, lying wet and freshly stamped, was a paper ticket bearing his name. The paper ticket lay on Nate's side of the yellow line. For a long moment, that was all he could see. Not the impossible platform crowded with versions of himself. Not Eli standing small and wet behind them. Not the man with the umbrella watching from his seat with the patience of someone waiting for a confession already written. Only the ticket. It had landed face up on the carriage floor. Damp around the corners. The old magnetic stripe dark against the scuffed gray surface. Across the middle, in purple ink, was printed, Nathaniel Bell, single, 17 oct. Platform, 17. Nate took one step backward. The painted yellow line on the carriage floor was fresh enough to shine. It ran from one set of closed doors to the other, dividing the train as neatly as a scale drawing. On the other side, closer to the doors, the paper ticket waited. He did not pick it up. He refused to pick it up. Outside, the platform began to move. Or the train did. The row of Nates slid past like figures on a conveyor belt. The injured one, the successful one in a tailored coat, the barefoot one, the one with the wedding ring, the one with no shoes and a beard matted beneath his chin, the child, Nate, who could not have been older than 7, clutching a red lunchbox, the furious Nate with both fists clenched as if he had spent his whole life preparing to strike someone and never chosen who. Then the tunnel took them. The carriage lights brightened. The yellow line remained. The ticket remained. Nate's mind did what it had always done best. It began to build an explanation. He was exhausted. That came first. Exhaustion could do astonishing things to the mind. He had read about railway workers hearing phantom announcements after long shifts. Bereaved people seeing the dead in crowds. Patients in hospitals mistaking coat racks for visitors. His own work required obsessive attention to small details. And detail, under stress, could become a trap. The brain was not a camera. It was a model maker. It selected, reduced, reconstructed. That was good. That was true. He clung to it. A panic episode. Then, not madness. Not haunting. Panic. Panic could narrow vision. Distort sound. Make the body feel outside itself. He had probably fallen asleep on the train and dreamed with his eyes open. Or there had been a service disruption. An emergency diversion. Some late-night maintenance route beneath stations closed to the public. The strange station signs might have been advertisements. The voices. Memory. The boy in the glass. Grief. The man with the umbrella. Some lonely old eccentric who had noticed him spiraling and decided to speak in riddles because London produced such men the way damp produced mold. Nate looked at the man. Delayed service, he said. The words sounded absurd in the carriage, but saying them steadied him. The man raised his eyebrows slightly. This is a delayed service. Nate continued. Or some kind of maintenance train. We pass through non-public platforms. That happens. There are disused stations, hidden parts of the network. Aldwych, Down Street, British Museum. All those ghost stations people make videos about. Someone's changed the signs. Students, film crew, prank, whatever. The phone calls are, he stopped. The man waited. The phone calls are a malfunction. Of course. I'm tired. Yes. I had a bad day. You did. And you're taking advantage of that. The man's expression did not change. Am I? Yes. In what way? Nate opened his mouth and closed it again, because he did not have an answer. The man had not moved from his seat. He had not touched Nate's phone. He had not produced the ticket. He had not forced Nate to look out of the window, to listen to the voicemail, to recognize the faces on the platforms. He had only named things after Nate saw them. That, somehow, made him worse. Nate bent suddenly and snatched the ticket from the floor. It was cold, not damp from ordinary rain, but cold in the way coins were cold when taken from a dead pocket in winter. His name blurred slightly beneath his thumb. He turned it over. On the back, where the magnetic stripe should have run unbroken, someone had written in blue biro, one choice unused. The handwriting was his, not his handwriting now, compressed and severe from years of labeling parts boxes and invoices. His handwriting at 14, tall letters, uneven pressure, the crossbar of the T too long, the L leaning forward as if trying to escape the rest of the word. He folded the ticket once and put it into his pocket with the torn corner from earlier. Then, immediately, he hated himself for doing it. Keeping was not believing. He told himself that keeping was evidence. Evidence was rational. Evidence belonged to the world. A man who collected evidence was not a man surrendering to a nightmare. The train rocked on. The next platform arrived without warning. This one was not named after a memory, but after an answer he had once given. Not my fault. The sign repeated along the wall in perfect underground lettering. Not my fault. Not my fault. Not my fault. A version of Nate stood beneath the middle sign in a dark blue suit he had never owned but instantly recognized as expensive. This Nate was broad in the shoulders, clean-shaven, silver at the temples. A black car waited behind him where the tiled wall should have been, its rear door open, rain shining on its roof, though they were deep underground. Successful Nate held a phone to his ear and smiled. Not happily, efficiently. Beside him stood a woman with a child in a pushchair. The woman's mouth was open, as if she had been speaking for some time. Pleading, maybe, or explaining. Successful Nate did not look at her. He looked past her, through the train, through Nathaniel Bell, at something more profitable beyond the glass. As the train passed, the child in the pushchair turned its head. It had Eli's eyes. Nate shut his own. When he opened them, the platform was gone. Projection, he said. His voice shook. The man said nothing. Guilt projection. Classic. I understand what's happening. I've associated public transport with a childhood trauma, and my mind is using professional failure to reconstruct old emotional material. The stations are symbolic. The versions of me are possible selves. The train is liminal because trains are places between. The man supplied. Nate pointed at him. Exactly. It's obvious. Is it helping? Nate laughed sharply. It's not meant to help. It's meant to be true. The man leaned back slightly. You have often confused those. The train entered another station. This one was so bright Nate had to raise a hand against the glare. The sign read, "The version that ran." The platform looked like a hospital corridor wearing the shape of a station. White floor, white walls, fluorescent lights buzzing with insect insistence. A metal bench sat behind the yellow line, and on it was a Nate in his 30s. One arm in a sling, one side of his face swollen purple and yellow. His shirt was torn at the collar. He stared at the floor with the stunned blankness of someone who had survived something by accident and could not decide whether survival had been a gift or an accusation. Around his wrist was a hospital band. As the train passed, injured Nate looked up and mouthed, "I told them everything." Then he pressed 2 fingers to his own throat, as if feeling for a pulse that had disappointed him. Nate's hand went to his neck. The motion frightened him more than the sight outside. He forced his hand down. "No," he said. "No, that's not memory. That never happened. I was never beaten. I was never in hospital. That isn't me. Not all of them are memories," the man said. Nate turned. "Then what are they? Consequences?" "Of what?" The man's eyes were dark and attentive. "You know, I don't. You do. I was a child." The words escaped before he could stop them. For the first time, the man's face changed. Not much. Something softened around the eyes. And for a second, Nate hated him for that softness more than he had hated any of the riddles. "Yes," the man said. "You were..." Nate sat down. The admission hung in the carriage. Small and naked. He had not meant to say it because it belonged too close to the thing itself. He had learned over the years that certain sentences were doors. Open one and you might find an entire room behind it, furnished exactly as you left it. Better to speak around them. Better to say accident, incident, confusion, bad day. Long ago, he had been a child. So had Eli. The train lights pulsed. Another platform. This one was dark, except for a single lamp above a bench. The station name was No One Left to Ask. A homeless Nate sat beneath the lamp, wrapped in layers of coats, plastic bags tied around his shoes. His beard was gray and knotted. His cheeks had hollowed. He held a paper cup in one hand and a model tree in the other, turning the tiny thing between finger and thumb with great concentration. When the train drew level, homeless, Nate looked up. His eyes were clear. He smiled with terrible gentleness and lifted the model tree as if offering it to Nate through the glass. Behind him, scratched into the tiled wall, were hundreds of names. Eli appeared only once. Nathaniel appeared on every tile. Nate looked away first. He pressed both palms against his eyes until sparks moved behind the lids. "You said this train carries people," he said. The man waited. "People who missed the important decision." "Yes, that doesn't make sense." "No? People miss decisions all the time. Everyone does. Everyone wonders what would have happened if they'd said yes, or left earlier, or stayed, or called someone back. That's life. That's not supernatural. That's regret. Regret is what people call the shape after they refuse to name the knife. Nate lowered his hands. "Stop speaking like that. What would you prefer? A straight answer." The man looked at him for a long time. "This train carries people who mistook fear for neutrality." The sentence entered Nate quietly. It did not strike at first. It settled. Mistook fear for neutrality. Outside the windows, the tunnel walls flashed by in black and silver bands. Nate tried to reject it. He wanted to. It was melodramatic, unfair. A child on a platform could not be expected to understand moral philosophy. A frightened older brother could not be charged like an adult in some invisible court because he had frozen, hesitated, looked away. Fear was not cruelty. Inaction was not action. Silence was not speech. But the train kept moving, and somewhere in his coat pocket, the ticket seemed to grow heavier. "What decision?" Nate asked. His voice was very low. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the floor. Nate followed his gaze. The yellow line painted across the carriage had lengthened. It no longer ran only by the doors. It stretched down the aisle now, bright and wet-looking, dividing the carriage from end to end. Every seat on Nate's side remained empty except his own. Every seat beyond the line was also empty. Yet he had the distinct impression of a crowd standing there just outside visibility, waiting behind a boundary no one had announced. "Fear gives a person many costumes," the man said. "Caution, obedience, sensible distance. Waiting for help, not making things worse. Letting adults handle it. Staying where one is told to stay." Nate's mouth had gone dry. "Sometimes those things are wise," the man continued. "Sometimes they are only names painted over cowardice." Nate stood again. "I was 14. I know. You keep saying that like it matters. Then you talk like it doesn't. It matters." The man's voice remained calm. "It does not erase." The train rushed into another platform. This one had no station sign at first. Only a child sitting cross-legged behind the yellow line with a red lunchbox in his lap. 7-year-old Nate. He was small, pale, solemn, wearing a jumper with one sleeve stretched from chewing the cuff. He looked impossibly young. Too young to be guilty of anything. Too young to know how much of a person was already forming in the habits adults called temperament. Beside him, written slowly across the tiled wall as the train moved, letters appeared in wet black strokes. "Before you learn to look away." The child Nate opened the lunchbox. Inside was not food. Inside lay dozens of tiny plastic figures, commuters, mothers, children, men with briefcases, old women, schoolboys. All of them had been snapped at the ankles so they could not stand. The child looked into the passing train and began to cry without making a sound. Nate turned away, breathing hard. "No more," he said. The man said, "There will be as many as you require. I don't require any." That is another thing people say here. The carriage seemed longer than before. Nate noticed it with a model maker's eye and wished he had not. The distance between the doors at one end and the connecting door at the other had stretched by perhaps 3 meters. Then 5. The pattern on the seats repeated too many times. The advertisements duplicated themselves, each one slightly altered. A life designed around you. A lie designed around you. A line designed around you. Nate began walking toward the far end of the carriage. He did not know what he intended. Perhaps to prove the carriage had not lengthened. Perhaps to force the connecting door. Perhaps simply to move, because sitting still felt too much like obedience. The yellow line ran beside him now, close enough that his left shoe nearly touched it. The man's voice followed. "You are careful not to cross." Nate stopped. He looked down. His feet were on one side of the line, the side away from the doors, the safe side. Something hot and humiliating rose in his chest. He stepped over the line. Nothing happened. For 1 second, victory flared in him, stupid and bright. Then every light in the carriage went out. In the complete dark, a hand took his. Small fingers, cold from rain. Eli's voice whispered beside him. Not from the window this time, but from the aisle. You crossed too late. You crossed too late. The hand holding Nate's was small, cold, and unmistakably real. He could feel each finger wrapped around his own, the soft pressure of a child's palm, the damp chill of rainwater trapped in skin, a faint tremor that might have been fear, or cold, or the memory of both. Nate could not see anything. The carriage had disappeared into complete black, not the usual darkness of a train passing between stations, not the dim, emergency gloom that left outlines and metal edges visible. This was the dark of shut eyes, the dark behind walls, the dark inside closed fists. He tried to pull his hand away. The fingers tightened. Nate. Eli whispered. The name passed through him with such force that he almost answered as he had answered once. Automatically. Irritably. With the exhausted authority of an older brother. What? He bit down on the word before it escaped. The train was still moving. He could hear it. Wheels striking rails somewhere beneath the dark. A hollow metallic rhythm that seemed too far below him now. As if the carriage had risen away from its own machinery. The floor under his shoes trembled, but not steadily. It pulsed like something breathing. Let go, Nate said. The child's hand remained. You said you would. I said let go. You said you'd only be a minute. Nate closed his eyes, though it made no difference in the dark. Memory opened, quick and sharp. A station. Rain. His blazer sleeve damp where Eli had grabbed it. Eli's face red with the effort of not crying in public. Nate, older by 3 years and therefore enormous with impatience. Their mother somewhere behind them. Delayed at the ticket barriers. Arguing with a machine that had swallowed her card. Wait there, Nate had said. Or had he? Had he said, don't follow me? Had he said, I'll come back? Had he said nothing at all? Only shaken Eli's hand off his sleeve and walked away because 3 boys from his school were watching from the stairs? The darkness throbbed. Then the lights came back. Nate was alone in the aisle. His hand was empty. He stood on the far side of the yellow line. One foot still lifted slightly, as if his body had frozen in the act of crossing. The carriage had changed while the dark held him. It was longer now. Impossible to deny. The doors at either end had receded into the distance. Rows of seats extended far beyond the proportions of any underground carriage, repeating under the strip lights until they blurred into red and blue smears. The ceiling curved too high. The poles were too thin and numerous, rising like yellow saplings in a steel forest. Advertisements repeated along the walls, each one a variation of the same cruel design. A life designed around you, a lie designed around you, a line designed around you, a life you left behind you. The air had become bitterly cold. Nate saw his breath. Across the carriage, the man with the umbrella was still sitting where he had been. Or perhaps the carriage had stretched around him and left him unchanged. The single fixed point in a room that no longer obeyed engineering. Nate's fingers ached from the vanished grip. He looked at the floor. The yellow line now ran the entire length of the carriage. Straight down the aisle, shining wetly under the lights. It divided every seat, every pole, every door. On one side, the side where Nate stood. The seats were empty but clean. On the other, closest to the doors, the seats were also empty. but water had gathered on the floor beneath them in thin reflective pools. In those pools, something moved, not in the carriage, in the reflection. Nate stepped back. The water trembled. The reflected ceiling lights quivered, broke, reformed. Then a figure appeared in the dark shine beneath the opposite seats. It was Nate again. Not outside on a platform this time. Not behind glass. Inside the reflection, crouched on the wet floor as if the whole world had been turned upside down beneath Nate's feet. This Nate wore the same school blazer as the boy on the first platform. 14. Thin, angry with fear. His tie was loosened. His cheeks were flushed. He was looking over his shoulder at something beyond the reflected window. In the reflection, young Nate made a choice. He saw Eli. He saw him standing too close to the yellow line, crying openly now. One hand pressed against his mouth because he had realized too late that he had followed the wrong person, or followed too far, or lost sight of the brother who was supposed to know what to do. Young Nate looked toward the stairs. 3 boys stood there. Nate did not know their names anymore. He had spent years sanding them away. But in the reflection, he knew them with sickening clarity. Oliver Pike, with his narrow fox face. Samir Holden, laughing behind one hand. Christopher Reeve, not the actor. Everyone had made that joke tall. Bored. Already cruel in the effortless way, some boys became cruel when they discovered adults would excuse it as confidence. They were looking at Eli, then at Nate, then back at Eli. Young Nate's mouth moved. Nate could not hear the words, but he knew their shape. He's not with me. The adult Nate stepped away from the water so abruptly that his shoulder struck a pole. No. The reflection rippled. It changed. Now another Nate appeared in the black window opposite him. Not 14. 20. Perhaps university age. Though Nate had never gone to university, this Nate stood in a dormitory corridor with a plastic cup in one hand, laughing with strangers. A girl touched his sleeve. Someone asked about family. The reflected Nate smiled and said, "Only child." The reflection changed again. 30-year-old Nate in his workshop, speaking to a woman with short, dark hair who stood in the doorway holding 2 takeaway coffees. Her expression was careful, hurt but not surprised. Her mouth formed the words, "You never talk about him." Reflected Nate shrugged. There's nothing to say. Another change. Nate at his mother's flat after the funeral, sorting through drawers with surgical efficiency. Bills, recipe cards, photographs, old birthday candles, a packet of school pictures and a rubber band. He found one of Eli and placed it in the rubbish bag, then stood perfectly still for 20 seconds before taking it out again and hiding it inside a book he later donated unopened. Another. Nate signing a contract for a redevelopment model near the station where Eli died. He noticed the address. He noticed the date of the public consultation. He noticed that the old entrance would be demolished. He signed anyway. Another Nate on a train years earlier, watching a child cry on a platform through the closing doors. The child was not Eli. A girl, perhaps 6, separated from her mother by a sudden rush of commuters. Nate's hand lifted toward the emergency alarm, then stopped. Someone else pulled it. The reflection went black. Nate staggered back to his side of the line. The man with the umbrella spoke. Choices repeat when they are not recognized. Nate turned on him, his voice raw. Those aren't choices. Those are moments, small moments. People say things. People avoid things. People survive. Yes, you're showing them like crimes. No, you are seeing them that way. Nate hated him for that. Hated the calmness. The precision, the way he made no accusation, because accusation would have given Nate something to resist. The cold deepened. Frost began to feather the edges of the windows from the inside. The train passed into another station. But it no longer felt as if the station existed outside. The platform lights came through the windows, pale and slow, while the carriage itself seemed to stretch toward them, hungry for their names. The first sign read, "The life where you spoke." On the platform stood a Nate with gray in his beard, wearing a cheap coat and holding a cardboard box against his chest. He looked tired, poorer than the real Nate, older than he should have been. But he stood upright. Beside him, a woman who might have been a solicitor or a social worker rested one hand on his shoulder. In the cardboard box lay newspaper clippings, photographs, police forms, old witness statements. Eli's name appeared on the top sheet. That Nate looked through the glass. He did not smile, but he was not alone. The next sign, "The life where you lied better." A handsome Nate in a clean black suit stood under warm light, speaking at a lectern. Behind him, a projected image showed one of his station models. Applause filled the platform. Though no hands moved, his hair was perfect. His face was composed. On the screen behind him, a tiny plastic boy lay under a miniature train, visible only from Nate's angle. The next sign, "The life where you followed." A thin, wild-eyed Nate stood barefoot on the platform, soaked to the skin, holding Eli's school blazer in both hands. His mouth was open in a scream that made no sound through the glass. Behind him, the tiled wall was covered in missing posters. Every poster showed Nate at a different age. The next, "The life where he lived." Nate stopped breathing. On that platform, there was no Nate at first. Only Eli, grown, 39 now, or close to it, taller than Nate remembered he had any right to be. His hair still fell across his forehead, though it had darkened. He wore a green jacket and carried a paper bag from a bakery. Laugh lines bracketed his mouth. He was speaking to someone just out of sight, smiling with easy irritation, the expression of a man interrupted during an ordinary day. Then another figure stepped beside him. Nate, older, softer, standing with a hand on Eli's shoulder as if the gesture were natural, practiced, allowed. The living Eli turned toward the passing train. His smile faded. For a moment, he looked directly at Nate, not with accusation, not with grief, but with mild confusion, as one might look at a stranger staring too intensely through a window. Then the platform was gone. Nate's knees weakened. He caught the pole with both hands and lowered himself into a seat. The line on the floor glistened beside his shoes. He had crossed it once, and nothing had changed. No, that was not true. Everything had changed, but not in the direction he wanted. Crossing too late was only another way of staying where he had always been. The man rose. It was the first time he had stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. He held the umbrella by its handle, tip resting on the floor. He did not cross the yellow line. He remained on his side, which Nate now realized was not his side at all. The man stood exactly on the boundary, One polished shoe, touching the edge, but not passing over. "Who are you?" Nate asked again. The question came out differently this time. Not angry, almost pleading. The man looked down the length of the impossible carriage. "No one important. Everyone on this train says that before they become important." The man's eyes returned to him. Nate frowned. "I didn't say that." "Yes," the man said. "You did." The carriage lights flickered. In the black windows, dozens of reflections appeared behind Nate's own. Versions of him filled the seats, stood in the aisle, leaned against the poles. Injured, successful, homeless, childlike, furious, old, young, clean, ruined. Every Nate he had seen on the platforms now rode inside the carriage with him, visible only in glass. None of them looked at him. They all looked toward the doors. The speaker system crackled. This time the voice was not recorded. It was Eli's voice, older and younger at once. "Next stop," it said. "The place you keep building around." The train began to slow. At the far end of the carriage, where no driver's cab should have been visible from inside, a door appeared. Small, gray, unmarked. A thin line of light showed underneath it. From beyond the door came the smell of wet concrete, brake dust, and the sweet glue Nate used for miniature figures. Then someone on the other side knocked 3 times. A child's knock, patient, waiting. The knock came again. 3 small taps, patient, polite, familiar. Nate stood in the aisle of the impossible carriage and looked toward the gray door that had appeared where no door should have been. It waited at the far end, beyond rows of empty seats, beyond yellow poles repeated into the cold distance, beyond the reflections of every version of himself who refused to meet his eye. The speaker crackled overhead. "Nate?" Eli's voice. Not the wet whisper from the glass. Not the recorded voicemail. This was clearer. Closer. Threaded through the train's failing electrics, as if the whole carriage had become an old telephone line. "Nate, I don't know where to stand." The words moved through him like a blade drawn carefully between ribs. He took 1 step toward the door. The man with the umbrella did not stop him. That made Nate hesitate more than any warning would have. "You said no one changes carriages after boarding," Nate said. The man looked toward the gray door. "That is not another carriage." "What is it?" "The place you never enter when you tell the story." Nate waited for more. None came. The train slowed, though no platform appeared outside. The windows showed only blackness, dense and glassy, with frost blooming inward from the corners. In those dark panes, the reflected Nates remained seated or standing, all facing the same way now. Toward the door, toward him. He wanted to sit down. He wanted to fold the ticket in his pocket until it tore and then throw the pieces under the seat. He wanted to wake with his cheek against the train window, embarrassed by a nightmare. 2 stops past home. The old man with the umbrella. Nothing more than a tired commuter avoiding eye contact. But from beyond the gray door came the smell again. Wet concrete, brake dust, rain on wool, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the sweet chemical scent of the glue he used to fix miniature figures into place. Nate began walking. The carriage stretched as he moved. Each step should have brought him closer, but the door seemed to withdraw. Not quickly, not enough to prove anything. only enough to suggest distance had become negotiable. The yellow safety line ran beside his right foot, bright under the lights. He did not cross it. He told himself this was not caution. There was simply no need. The reflected versions of himself watched from the windows. Child Nate with the broken lunchbox. Teenage Nate with rain on his blazer. Successful Nate with his perfect hair and empty eyes. Homeless Nate holding the tiny model tree. The Nate from the life where Eli lived. That one hurt the most. The reflected living Eli Nate stood just behind the glass with one hand raised. Not waving. Not accusing. Only touching the pane as if testing whether there was still a surface between them. Nate looked away. The door knocked a third time. He reached it. There was no handle, only a narrow metal plate. When he touched it, the plate was warm. The rest of the train was freezing, but the door was warm as skin. "Nate," Eli's voice said through the speaker. "Mom's angry." Nate closed his eyes. He remembered their mother, angry at ticket barriers, angry at late buses, angry at both boys for growing out of school shoes in the same month. But underneath that small domestic anger had always been panic wrapped in practical tasks. She counted coins twice. She checked oven knobs 3 times before bed. She said, "Stay where I can see you." With the force of a prayer, Nate pushed the door. It opened inward. Beyond it was not a driver's cab. There were no controls. No dead man's handle. No instrument panel. No front window looking into the tunnel. Instead, Nate stepped into his workshop, or something wearing its skin. The room was small, low-ceilinged, and lit by 2 desk lamps with green metal shades. Shelves rose along the walls, filled with wood strips, acrylic sheets, tins of paint, packets of plastic figures, bottles of glue, old scalpel handles, curled tracing paper, and boxes labeled in his own handwriting. But there were no windows, no door behind him after he entered, no sound from the phone shop downstairs or the bad piano above, only the low murmur of the train still moving somewhere beyond the walls. At the center of the room stood a table. On the table was a model station. Nate knew it before he approached. Not because he had built it. He had not. He had never built this station. He had refused every commission near it when he could afford to refuse, and taken one only when he needed the money badly enough to hate himself quietly afterward. But he knew the proportions. The curve of the platform, the tiled wall with green trim, the old wooden bench beneath a poster for a seaside holiday, the stairs descending from the ticket hall, the narrow pinch point where the platform widened near the tunnel mouth, the yellow line, painted with microscopic care. Platform 17. It had not actually been called that. Not officially. That was only the number on the internal map, the one printed on the sign near the steps. But in Nate's memory, it had become the station's true name. Not the stop itself, not the line, just the platform. Platform 17. The place where something had been left unfinished. He leaned over the model. Every detail was exact. A discarded newspaper lay by the bench, no larger than a thumbnail. A coffee stain darkened the tiles near a bin. The rail tracks glinted with black paint. The tunnel mouth at the end of the platform had been hollowed with impossible depth when Nate looked into it. He felt the pull of air from an approaching train. There were figures, tiny figures, a woman at the ticket barrier above the stairs. One arm raised in frustration. Their mother. Even at that scale, he knew her coat. beige and belted. The one she wore until the cuffs frayed. 3 boys by the stairwell, clustered together. Oliver Pike, Samir Holden, Christopher Reeve. Names he had not allowed himself to know for years returned with cruel ease, each one slotting into place like a cut piece of plastic. And 2 boys on the platform, one near the wall, one near the yellow line. Nate gripped the table edge. The boy near the wall was him, 14-year-old Nathaniel Bell, stiff in his damp blazer, school bag hanging from one shoulder, face turned away with deliberate blankness. He was not far from Eli. That was the first thing Nate saw, and the sight injured him because some part of him had spent decades expanding the distance. In the story he told himself, he had been farther away. At the vending machine, at the stairs, already turning the corner, out of sight when the train came. But the model did not permit that mercy. Tiny Nate stood close enough to touch his brother if he had taken 3 quick steps. 2, maybe. Eli stood by the yellow line, not on it, not over it, beside it. His hand was half raised toward Nate. The figure was so small that the expression should have been impossible to read. Yet Nate saw it clearly. Confusion first, then embarrassment, then the beginning of fear as Eli understood that his brother was pretending not to know him. Nate backed away from the table. Behind him, shelves rattled softly. Packets of miniature people trembled in their plastic bags. The speaker in the low ceiling crackled. This time it was not Eli. It was Nate's own voice at 14. He's not with me. Nate turned sharply. There was no one in the room. The voice came again. Clearer, thin with shame and forced indifference. He's not with me. Then laughter. 3 boys laughing by the stairs. Not loud, not monstrous. That was the awful thing. It was ordinary schoolboy laughter. Sharp and brief. The kind that lived for the flinch it caused and moved on before any adult could call it cruelty. Nate covered his ears. The sound remained. On the model. Something moved. Tiny Eli shifted. His raised hand lowered slowly. Tiny Nate turned his face farther away. No. Adult, Nate said. No. I didn't, but he stopped because he did not know how to finish. I didn't mean it. I didn't understand. I didn't think he would move. All of those might be true. None of them changed the model. The room grew colder. A drawer under the table slid open by itself. Inside lay tools, tweezers, scalpel, brush, glue siring, small pliers, and beside them, a paper ticket, full-sized, old, damp, stamped with the same date, 17 Oct. Nate picked it up. On the back, in his 14-year-old handwriting, was written, "Move him." He looked at the model. The train had begun to enter the miniature platform. A pinprick of light appeared inside the tiny tunnel. Then 2 lights. The rails hummed faintly under the model, though nothing mechanical was visible. Air moved across the table, stirring the little newspaper, lifting the edge of their mother's coat. Tiny Eli turned toward the lights. Nate understood with a suddenness that made him gasp. This was not only a model, it was a choice presented at scale. He reached for the tweezers. His hand shook so violently that the metal tips clicked against the drawer. If he moved Eli, what then? What did that mean? A trick, a temptation, a symbolic exercise staged by a train that had stolen his dead brother's voice. A hallucination asking him to perform remorse with tools. A cruel little theater. But the tiny headlights grew brighter. The sound of the approaching train rose from inside the table. Nate seized the tweezers and leaned over the platform. His breath disturbed the figures. He tried to grip Eli around the waist. The tweezers passed through him. Nate froze. He tried again. The same. The metal tips closed on empty air. Tiny Eli stood untouched beside the yellow line. The headlights widened. "No," Nate whispered. The speaker above him crackled. Eli's voice returned, calm and terribly close. "You can't move me from where you are." Nate looked down at the model, then at tiny Nate near the wall. His own younger figure stood rigid, close enough, silent enough, safe enough. The tweezers in adult Nate's hand trembled. The instruction on the ticket had not meant Eli. Move him, not the brother by the line, the boy by the wall. Nate reached toward his own miniature figure. This time, the tweezers closed around solid plastic. The room went silent. Even the miniature train stopped humming. Nate held tiny 14-year-old Nathaniel Bell between the metal tips, lifted him from the platform, and saw beneath his shoes a dark red mark painted on the tile where he had been standing. Not blood, an X, a place marked for return. Then the workshop door behind him, which had not been there a moment ago, opened onto the roaring dark of the tunnel. And from inside that dark, the real Eli screamed. Eli screamed from inside the tunnel. The sound tore through the workshop with such force that the desk lamps flashed white and went out. For one blind second. Nate was back in the underground carriage, back in the dark with a cold child's hand in his, back on every platform and in every reflection at once. Then the lamps flickered alive again, weaker now, their green shades trembling on their brass stems. The door behind him stood open. Beyond it was not the carriage. Beyond it was the tunnel mouth from the model, enlarged to human scale. Black brick curved away into darkness. The rails shone wetly. A hot wind pushed through the opening, carrying brake dust, rainwater, and the coppery smell of electricity sparking against metal. The scream had stopped. That was worse. Nate still held the tiny figure of himself in the tweezers. 14-year-old Nathaniel Bell dangled there, rigid and absurd, no bigger than a matchstick. His school bag molded against one shoulder. Beneath the place where the figure had stood, the red X on the miniature platform glistened. Nate lowered the figure back toward the model. The moment its feet touched the X, the whole table shuddered. A drawer beneath the opposite side slid open. Inside was a folder. Not a model-making folder. Not tracing paper or printed plans. A police case file? Gray-blue, water-damaged at the edges. Its metal fastener rusted brown. Across the front, a label had been typed and stuck on crookedly. British Transport Police. Incident report. 17. October. Platform 17. Below that, in smudged ink, alias Bell. Age 11. Nate stared at the name. Elias. Not Eli. No one but official forms had ever called him that. Teachers on the first day of term. Dentists. The passport office. Police officers speaking gently to a mother who could not understand why gentleness made everything final. Nate did not touch the file at first. As long as he did not open it, it remained only an object, Objects could be misunderstood. Props could be planted. This room had already shown it could build anything from memory. It could fabricate paperwork as easily as platforms, voices, and miniature boys. But then water began to seep from the folder. Not much. A dark line first, spreading across the drawer bottom, then dripping steadily onto the floor. Tick, 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 like flowers held upside down on an escalator, like rain falling from Eli's blazer, like seconds. Nate set the tiny figure down beside the model and reached for the file. The cover was cold and soft from damp. Inside were pages, real pages, or real enough to resist his fingers. Typed statements, diagrams, photocopies, timelines. One corner of a black and white CCTV still. Some sections were blurred by water damage, but others remained cruelly clear. Nate read the first page without meaning to. At approximately 1642, station staff were alerted by passengers to a minor disorder involving school-age youths on Platform 17. Reports indicate raised voices and possible pushing near the northbound line. At approximately 1644, the approaching train entered the platform. Emergency brake activation occurred after impact. His throat closed. He turned the page. Witness A, adult female, stated that one boy appeared distressed and was looking toward another boy in the same uniform. Witness believed the second boy was known to him. Witness B stated, the younger one kept saying Nate. He said it 2 or 3 times. The older boy looked over but didn't go to him. Nate pressed his palm flat against the paper, as if he could stop the sentence from continuing. It continued beneath his hand. Witness C, station employee, stated that the older boy was positioned approximately 4 meters from the younger boy prior to the incident. 4 metros. Nate whispered it before he understood that he had spoken. 2.4 meters. Not across the platform. Not up the stairs. Not out of sight. Less than 3 meters. The distance from his workshop table to the far wall. The length of a sofa. A few steps taken quickly by someone who meant them. He turned another page. A diagram showed the platform from above. Clean lines. Measured distances. The kind of drawing Nate understood immediately, because it reduced terror into legible space. There was the track. There was the yellow line. There was Eli. Mark at E. B. There were the 3 boys near the stairs. There was their mother at the ticket barrier. There was N. B. Nathaniel Bell. A small black dot near the wall. Between N, B, and E. B. A line marked to Fort Metter. Someone had circled it in red. The circle was not from the original report. It was newer, drawn by hand. His hand, adult handwriting this time, beside it. In the margin, enough time, Nate let the folder fall. Pages spilled across the floor. The tunnel beyond the open door breathed. He backed away from the evidence, shaking his head. No, that's not right. The speaker above the model table crackled. For a moment, static filled the room. Then an announcement played. It was not the clean, genderless voice of modern recordings. It was older, thinner, warped slightly by distance and echo. Stand clear of the platform edge. The next train does not stop at Regret. Stand clear of the platform edge. Nate looked up. The announcement repeated. But this time beneath it ran another sound, a station PA from long ago, layered under the impossible warning. Northbound train approaching platform 17. Please stand behind the yellow line. Then a second voice. Closer. Human. Hurried. Can someone move him back? A third voice. He's with that older boy. A pause. Which older boy? And then, faint but unmistakable, his own young voice. He's not with me. The words filled the workshop. They did not echo dramatically. They simply existed, flat and exact. The way evidence existed. Nate covered his mouth. The file had not lied. The model had not exaggerated. The memory he had kept for 28 years had been edited at the cut point most useful to him. He remembered Eli by the line. He remembered the train. He remembered shouting after the impact, or believed he did. He remembered his mother's face. He remembered police asking questions. He remembered saying, over and over, I didn't see, but there had been a moment before all of that. A small, survivable moment. Eli had been embarrassed. Nate had been embarrassed. The boys by the stairs had been watching. Their mother had been delayed. The train had not yet arrived. No metal had screamed. No adult had lunged. No tragedy had become inevitable. Only a younger brother asking silently, then aloud, for the older one to claim him. And Nate had refused. Not by accident. Not from across the station. Not without understanding. He had looked at Eli and chosen the approval of cruel boys over the hand reaching toward him. The room tilted. Nate caught the table edge. The model station rattled. Miniature figures toppled. Their mother leaned against the ticket barrier. Oliver Pike fell flat on his face. Tiny Eli remained standing by the line, immovable. The full-sized paper ticket lay on the table beside the model. Nate had not noticed it there before. He picked it up. This ticket was different from the others. Cleaner, less faded. On the front, printed beneath the date, was a departure time. Geloden Sijarfen. On the back, written in blue biro, you had until 1644. 2 minutes. Nate stopped breathing. 2 minutes was enormous. 2 minutes was nothing. 2 minutes was enough to cross 4 metres. Enough to say, he's my brother. Enough to take Eli's sleeve. Enough to stand with him until their mother arrived. Enough to be laughed at. Enough to survive humiliation. Enough to prevent a life from ending. He remembered then not the whole thing. Not kindly, but with the brutal completeness of a drawer yanked open. Eli had followed him down the stairs because he hated being left behind. Their mother had told Nate to keep him close. Nate had already been angry about that. Angry that he could never go anywhere without Eli trailing after him. Angry that school had become a place where having a small, odd brother who talked to reflections gave people weapons. The three boys had seen them. Oliver Pike had grinned. Is that your little boyfriend? Belle? Eli had not understood at first. Then he had. His ears had gone red. He had stepped closer to Nate. Nate had felt the whole platform watching, though it was not. He had felt 14 years old, which meant he felt enormous shame and no size at all. He's not with me, he said. Eli froze. The boys laughed. Eli backed away, not toward the track deliberately, not as some dramatic response, just away from shame, away from his brother's refusal, Away from laughter, his heel touched the yellow line. The announcement began. Northbound, train approaching. Nate remembered seeing the train lights in the tunnel. He remembered thinking, move. He remembered not moving. Not because he could not. Because if he moved then, everyone would know he had lied. The truth landed inside him without thunder. Quiet. Final. A fact fitting into the exact space it had always occupied. The speaker crackled again. This time, the announcement spoke in the voice of the man with the umbrella. Evidence is not punishment. Evidence is mercy. It is the end of negotiation. The open tunnel darkened. Footsteps approached from inside it. Not heavy adult footsteps. Not the polished step of the man in the carriage. School shoes on wet concrete. Nate turned toward the door. Eli stood in the tunnel mouth. Not reflected, not miniature, not on a platform beyond glass. He stood at full size as he had been at 11, soaked through, face pale beneath wet hair. One hand closed around a paper ticket that had nearly dissolved in his fist. For the first time, he did not look frightened. He looked tired. Nate, he said, tell it from the beginning. Behind him, far down the tunnel, train lights appeared. Nate, Eli said, tell it from the beginning. The train lights grew behind him. At first, they were only 2 pale points in the tunnel, no larger than pinheads. Then they widened, brightened, gathered the wet rails into silver lines. The old air pushed ahead of them, warm and filthy, carrying the smell of metal dust, damp wool, and something electrical burning. Nate stood in the false workshop with the police file open at his feet, the paper ticket in his hand, and his brother waiting in the tunnel mouth. He could not speak. All his life, the beginning had moved. Sometimes the story began with rain, sometimes with a faulty ticket barrier, sometimes with his mother distracted and angry, sometimes with Eli following when he had been told not to, sometimes with the cruelty of boys, sometimes with the train, never with Nate. That had been the genius of it. Begin the story late enough and innocence became plausible. He looked down at the model. Tiny Eli stood by the yellow line. Tiny Nate stood near the wall, replaced on the red X where the tweezers had set him down. Their mother remained frozen above the stairs. The 3 boys watched. The miniature train waited inside the tunnel, its headlights burning brighter with every real second. Eli's full-sized figure watched him from the doorway. From the beginning, he said again. Nate's lips moved. I was embarrassed. The words entered the room softly. The tunnel behind Eli dimmed. As if listening, Nate took a breath that scraped his throat. I was embarrassed because you followed me, because they saw you, because they laughed, because I thought if I admitted you were my brother, they would make me small. Eli did not blink. I wanted you to move away from me. Nate said, not far, just enough that they'd stop looking. I wanted you to understand without me having to say it. And when you didn't, I said you weren't with me. The room seemed to contract around the confession. The shelves leaned inward. Packets of miniature people slid forward in their boxes. 1,000 tiny painted faces pressed against clear plastic. Watching him, Nate looked at the model, at the 2 boys separated by a distance that had become the measurement of his life. You backed away, he said. You were crying. I saw the train lights. I heard the announcement. I knew you were too close. His voice broke. but nothing in the room softened for him. And I thought if I went to you, they would know I had lied. The approaching train roared louder. Eli's face changed then, not into anger. Nate almost wished it had. Anger would have given him something simple to receive. Instead, what crossed Eli's face was recognition, deep and exhausted, as if he had been waiting 28 years not to hear an apology, but to hear the shape of the truth spoken without decoration. You had time, Eli said. Nate nodded. Tears came, but they felt useless, late, almost indecent. I had time. The lights in the tunnel flared. For a moment, everything became white. Then the workshop was gone. Nate stood in the carriage again. The impossible long carriage. The cold carriage. The one divided by the yellow line that ran its full length like a wound carefully painted over. He stood near the doors, gripping the paper ticket. The man with the umbrella was seated across from him once more, hands folded, still as judgment. But something had changed. The train was slowing, not gliding through another platform, slowing to stop. The brakes screamed. High, an animal. Lights passed across the windows in bands. The reflected Nates who had filled the glass now turned their faces toward him one by one. Injured Nate, successful Nate, homeless Nate, child Nate, old Nate, the Nate who had spoken, the Nate who had lied better, the Nate from the life where Eli lived. All of them watched as the train entered a station. The sign on the wall read, "The place you stood." The train stopped. For the first time since embankment, the doors opened. The sound was ordinary. A soft pneumatic release. Ashim. The familiar gap between carriage and platform. Yet the ordinary sound struck Nate harder than any scream. After all the impossible stations, all the reflections, all the dead voices, the simple opening of doors felt like permission granted by something too old to care whether he survived it. Cold air entered the carriage. The platform outside was exactly as the model had shown it. Cream tiles, green trim, a bench beneath an old holiday poster. The stairs at the far end, the curve before the tunnel mouth, the yellow line shining on damp concrete. But it was not empty. Every version of Nate stood on the platform. They were arranged behind the yellow line in a long, silent row. The child with the red lunchbox, the teenager with rain on his blazer, the successful man in the tailored coat, the homeless man with the model tree, the injured man with the hospital band, the old man with the broken ticket, the Nate who had flowers, the Nate who had no shoes, the Nate from the life where Eli lived, standing apart from the others, face full of grief for a brother he had somehow kept. They did not move. They were not waiting for the train. They were waiting for Nate. Behind them, near the wall, stood Eli, 11 years old, wet, pale, tired, and beside Eli stood another figure Nate had not noticed at first because his mind had refused to make room for him. The man with the umbrella, not in the carriage now, on the platform. He stood exactly where young Nate had stood in the model, near the wall, close enough to cross, far enough to pretend distance was destiny. His charcoal overcoat was buttoned to the throat. His umbrella rested against one leg. He watched Eli with an expression so carefully neutral that Nate felt sick. Then Nate understood. The man in the carriage was not a guide, not a judge, not a stranger appointed by some railway afterlife to explain the rules. He was Nate, Not old Nate from a possible future. Not a symbolic version. Not one life among many. He was the Nate who never moved. The Nate who stayed beside the wall while the train came in. The Nate who learned to fold fear into stillness and call it sense. The Nate who had spent 28 years sitting in a carriage, speaking calmly about decisions. Because calmness was what cowardice sounded like after it had grown old. The man turned from Eli and looked through the open train doors. Their eyes met. Nate saw himself in him then, not in the surface details. Not only the shape of the brow or the tightness around the mouth, but in the posture, the careful economy of movement, the way he occupied space without seeming to ask permission from it, the way he refused to appear frightened. "You," Nate whispered. The man stepped into the carriage. Or perhaps he had never left it. He was suddenly seated opposite Nate again, umbrella across his knees, while his double remained on the platform by the wall. Two positions at once. The place of the passenger and the place of the boy. The observer and the one who refused to act. "You said you were no one important," Nate said. The man looked tired now, older than before. Less like a figure of authority and more like someone who had run out of disguises. "I was what remained useful." "To whom? To you?" Nate looked out at the platform. The younger version stood unmoving. Eli waited near the line. The old announcement speaker crackled overhead. "Northbound train approaching platform 17. Please stand behind the yellow line." Nate flinched. The sound no longer belonged to memory. It was happening. Down the tunnel. Two lights appeared. The platform, Nate's, did not react. None of them moved toward Eli. None called out. None crossed the yellow line. They stood in their many costumes of consequence, all born from one stillness. The man with the umbrella spoke quietly. "Every platform you saw was not a punishment designed for you. It was growth. One refusal becoming habits. One habit becoming character. One character becoming a life." Nate turned to him. "The successful one, a man who learned that looking away was profitable. The homeless one, a man who finally saw too much and had nowhere to put it. The injured one, a man who confessed late and paid in ways he could measure. The child, the part that learned shame before courage. And you," the man's hand tightened on the umbrella handle. "I am the moment preserved. Outside." Eli looked toward the tunnel lights. He raised one hand again, not waving, asking. Nate remembered that hand. Remembered its exact height. Not dramatic. Not reaching desperately into space. Just lifted toward the person who should have come. "Why are you on the train?" Nate asked the man. "Because you boarded every night after doom," the man said. "Not with your body. With every silence. Every time you left his name out. Every time you made a model where people could not touch. Every time someone needed you to step over a line and you measured the distance instead." The train lights in the tunnel grew brighter. The old platform began to tremble. Eli's hair lifted in the wind. Nate stepped toward the doors. The man said, "Careful." The word stopped him. Not because it was powerful. Because it was familiar. Careful had ruled his life. Careful with blades. Careful with glue. Careful with invoices. Careful with clients. Careful with memories. Careful with people who might need too much. Careful with truth. Careful with shame. Careful not to cross until crossing could no longer cost him anything. He looked down. The yellow line inside the carriage met the yellow line on the platform with perfect alignment. A single boundary. A single sentence. On one side, Nate stood in the train. On the other, Eli stood in the past. The man with the umbrella rose behind him. "If you step off," he said, "you will not arrive where you think." Nate did not turn. "Where will I arrive?" "At the decision." "Can I change it?" The question came out like a child's. The man did not answer quickly. Outside, the approaching train screamed in the tunnel. "No," he said at last. "Not what happened." Nate's throat tightened. "Then what's the point?" The man looked toward Eli. And for the first time, Nate saw grief in his face without restraint. To stop making him stand there alone. The answer hollowed Nate out. For years, he had imagined redemption as reversal, if guilt had a cure. Surely it had to be impossible. Go back. Move faster. Say the right thing. Take the sleeve. Pull Eli away. Anything less felt like theater. Anything less felt insulting. But the train offered no miracle, only presence. Only the one thing he had withheld. The speaker crackled again. This time the announcement came in Nate's own 14-year-old voice. Flat and ashamed, he's not with me. Then, layered beneath it, 1,000 later voices. I'm an only child. There's nothing to say. It was an accident. I didn't see. I was too far away. I had no time. I had no choice. The voices gathered until the carriage shook with them. Nate covered his ears. But they were inside him. Across the platform, Eli lowered his hand. The train in the tunnel was almost there. Nate stepped to the threshold. The gap between carriage and platform looked black and bottomless. Wind tore at his coat. Behind him, the long carriage stretched into freezing light, full of seats where no one living would ever sit. Ahead, the platform waited with every self he had become or might have become, standing behind the line. The man with the umbrella came to stand beside him, not blocking him, not helping, just standing where he had always stood. Nate looked at him and saw the boy beneath the old face, terrified of laughter, terrified of being small, terrified of love when love required public courage. I thought not choosing meant I couldn't be blamed, Nate said. The man closed his eyes. That was the first thing we built. Nate looked back at Eli. His brother's face was lit now by the oncoming train. He seemed very young. Too young to be responsible for anyone else's shame. Too young to become the center of a lifetime's architecture. Nate stepped over the yellow line. The platform struck his feet. For a moment, every version of him inhaled. The successful man lowered his phone. The homeless man crushed the model tree in his fist. The child with the lunchbox stood up. The old man stopped crying. The injured one removed the hospital band from his wrist. The Nate from the life where Eli lived turned his face away. The man with the umbrella remained in the carriage. He looked smaller there. Suddenly, not powerful, not wise, only old fear wearing a good coat. The doors began to close. Nate turned back. The man raised one hand, not in farewell, but in the same small gesture Eli had made, asking for one terrible second. Nate understood that even this version of him wanted rescue. Then the doors shut. The train began to move. Through the glass, the man with the umbrella sat down again. The carriage slid away into the tunnel, carrying the preserved moment. The witness, the coward, the explanation. But as it passed, Nate saw the man's reflection fracture in the black window into all the other selves, all the platforms, all the lives grown from a single refusal. Then the train was gone. Silence fell over platform 17. No, not silence. The approaching train was still coming. Eli stood by the yellow line, hand half raised, eyes on Nate. Nate turned toward him. This time, there were no boys laughing by the stairs. Or perhaps there were, but their laughter no longer mattered. This time, Nate moved. This time, Nate moved. He crossed the platform in 3 steps. Not graceful steps, not heroic ones. His shoes slipped on the wet concrete. His coat dragged behind him in the wind of the approaching train. For one sickening instant, he felt the old reflex seize his body. The calculation, the distance, the danger, the shame. The tiny voice that said, "Careful, careful, careful." He kept moving anyway. Eli watched him come. The boy's hand remained half raised, uncertain now. As if after all this time, he no longer knew whether help arriving late still counted as help. Nate stopped beside him. Not in front of him, not behind him, beside him. The train lights filled the tunnel. The rails screamed. The platform shook beneath their feet. Eli looked up at him. "You came back," he said. Nate wanted to say yes, but that would have been another lie. And this place had been built from lies old enough to know his voice. "No," Nate said. "I didn't." Eli's face did not change. Nate swallowed. "Not then." The wind pushed Eli's wet hair across his eyes. Nate reached out slowly, afraid the boy would vanish. Afraid he would not. His fingers touched Eli's shoulder. Solid, cold, small. The contact broke something in him that confession had only cracked. Nate had touched grief before. Photographs, tickets, old coats, hospital paperwork, his mother's hand at the funeral. But he had not touched this. The person at the center, the child who had not been a symbol, not a wound, not the origin of Nate's private architecture. His brother. The train burst from the tunnel. Nate turned and pulled Eli against him. There was no miracle. The platform did not dissolve into white light. Time did not reverse. No adult appeared at the last second. No hand rewrote the report. The train came on with all the force of the life that had already happened. But Eli was not alone when the light reached them. Nate held him and felt the boy's fingers clutch the front of his coat. "I'm sorry," Nate said. The words disappeared beneath the roar. He said them again anyway. The train passed through them. For a moment there was impact without pain, brightness without shape. Nate felt himself scattered through every carriage he had ever taken, every station model he had ever built, every room where someone had needed him, and he had measured the cost of kindness before deciding it was too high. He saw his workshop emptied. He saw the failed model at Old Street, its tiny plastic commuters lying on their sides. He saw his mother at the kitchen table years after Eli died, holding a photograph and waiting for Nate to ask about it. He had not asked. He saw the woman with the takeaway coffee standing in his workshop doorway, realizing he would never invite her into the room where his grief lived. He saw strangers on platforms, children separated from parents, old men struggling with bags, Friends calling after long silences. Messages left unread. Small moments. Not all tragic. Not all dramatic. But each one a line. Each one asking whether he would cross. Then the brightness ended. Nate opened his eyes. The platform was empty. No row of alternate selves. No boys by the stairs. No mother at the barrier. No man with an umbrella. No Eli. Only the station as it had been and had never been. Cream tiles. Green trim. Damp concrete. A yellow line shining beneath old lights. At his feet lay 2 paper tickets. One bore Eli's name. One bore his own. The edges touched. Far down the tunnel. The train that did not stop was leaving. Nate could see its rear lights shrinking into the dark. Red and small and final. In the last window of the last carriage, the man with the umbrella sat alone. For a moment, the man turned his head. Nate expected accusation, or forgiveness, or some final revelation to explain what this had been. Instead, the man only looked tired. Then the train entered the dark and was gone. The platform lights flickered. An announcement crackled overhead in the ordinary recorded voice of the underground. Please take all personal belongings with you. Nate almost laughed. The sound came out like a sob. He bent and picked up the 2 tickets. Eli's ticket was damp and soft. His own was dry. On the back of his, the words had changed. Not for return. He put Eli's ticket in his left coat pocket. He held his own in his hand. At the far end of the platform, stairs led upward. They had not been there before. Nate walked toward them. With each step, the station seemed to lose detail. The poster on the wall blurred into pale color. The tiles became less cracked, then more cracked, then neither. The yellow line remained sharp until the very end, bright as fresh paint. Halfway up the stairs, he heard a child behind him. Nate? He stopped. He did not turn immediately. For most of his life, turning had been the problem. Turning away. Turning memory into shape. Turning truth into something small enough to store. This time, he turned back. Eli stood at the bottom of the stairs. Not wet now. Not smiling either. Just watching him with a seriousness too old for his face. What happens now? Eli asked. Nate looked at the ticket in his hand. I don't know. Are you going home? Nate thought of his flat. The narrow kitchen. The unwatered plant on the sill. The shelves of tools. The boxes of tiny people waiting to be placed where they could not choose to stand. He thought of morning, if morning still existed. He thought of calling someone. He thought of the police report, the real one or the impossible one. He thought of saying Eli's name aloud to another living person for the first time in years. I might try, he said. Eli nodded, as if that answer was neither enough nor nothing. Then the boy stepped backward into the dimness of the platform. The lights flickered once, and he was gone. Nate climbed the rest of the stairs. At the top, there was no ticket hall, only an exit gate standing open beneath a sign that read "Way Out." Beyond it, dawn pressed against the glass doors of a station he did not recognize. London waited outside in early gray light, wet pavement. Shuttered shops. A bus sighing at the curb. A woman in a green coat walking away with flowers held upright this time. Nate stepped through the gate. It did not beep. Outside, The rain had stopped. For a while, he stood on the pavement with the ticket in his hand, letting the city move around him. People passed without looking. A cyclist cursed at a van somewhere underground. A train roared through a tunnel. Nate unfolded the ticket one last time. The ink was fading. His name disappeared first, then the date, then the station. By the time the paper became blank, his phone began to ring. The screen showed no number, only a name, Eli. Nate stared at it until the ringing nearly stopped. Then, with his thumb trembling above the glass, he answered. Some hauntings are not about the dead coming back to punish us. Sometimes they are about the moment we refuse to move, and the life that grew around that refusal. Nate's horror was never only the train, or the platform, or the versions of himself waiting in the dark. It was the terrible discovery that silence can become a choice, and a choice can become a person. Maybe redemption is not always being allowed to change the past. Maybe sometimes it is simply standing, at last, beside the one you abandoned, and telling the truth without asking it to save you. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey. Thank you so much for spending these quiet hours with me here at chilly midnight. Your presence means the world to this small space. Now, it's time to let go of the day behind you. Rest your mind, breathe softly, and allow yourself to drift into a deep, healing sleep. May your dreams be filled with peace, and may you wake up tomorrow feeling completely refreshed and renewed. Take care. Sleep well, and sweet dreams. My dear friend, until the darkness calls us together again, good night.